وانفجارات كبيرة وهائلة، وربما هذا ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello, welcome to Varn Blog, and today we're here with Dr. Daniel Tutt, host of Jouissance Vampires and professor of all kinds of things, film studies, psychoanalysis, general cultural studies, I think. So the first question is really broad, but it's something I think about a lot. And that is, given Freud's politics, in particular in the politics of early psychoanalysis, why has psychoanalysis generally been associated in a broad spectrum sort of way with left-wing politics, from the Frankfurt School through early Christopher Lash up through anti-psychiatry, anti-psychoanalysis, the resurgence of Lacanian psychoanalysis on the left, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. What's the reason for it?
Yeah, I think because Freud was responding to the concepts are to be understood in the political side of contestation, right? Like Vienna at the turn of the century was a fucked up place, an interesting place politically. Like there's a reason why Trotsky was so interested there, you know, like there was liberals, there was communists, there was socialists, there was the whole gamut. There was this profound cosmopolitan energy. There was on one side the Bolshevik event, on the other side a creeping fascism. So it was a kind of cauldron of grand experimentation and thought, both scientific thought. Of course, Freud was obsessed with the idea of creating psychoanalysis as a Weltanschauung, as a kind of comprehensive worldview, wanted to further it as a existential answer to the comprehensive position on human existence as such, which is why he referred to his discoveries as a Copernican revolution. Of course, the debate about the scientificity of psychoanalysis is one maybe we could talk about. So, yeah, I mean, it's been a bit of a paradox as to why so many communists and left-wing causes have found such a resolve in psychoanalysis. I mean, Trotsky was fond of it. Guattari had Trotskyist origins. Not many people know that. Lacan always flirted with the communist cause, even though he was slightly cowardly about it at times. And of course, Lacan in his later work will basically turn to Marx to, according to Samuel Tomšek, the young Slovenian philosopher who is trained by, Žižek and Dolar and Supančič in Slovenia. In his book, Marx and Lacan on the Capitalist Unconscious, he shows that the very definition of the symptom is understood through a kind of extraordinarily close study that Lacan did of Marx, of Marxism, but also of capital. And so he generates a kind of productive theory of desire, which of course still lives in Guattari. Guattari is one of his students. So it's complex. There's Maoism in France is a weird thing for the bourgeoisie. The École Normale Supérieure is a kind of weird institution. It's kind of like a Harry Potter institution, but had elements of radicalism. I mean, I think the best way to understand why French theory, I always tell to my students, is reading a book called Turning on the Mind, French Philosophers on Television, which shows a very interesting thought experiment or interesting fact, which is that the French state funded philosophers to be public celebrities following the war as a specific kind of national effort to garner patriotism in the kind of philosophes of the French Revolution and some nostalgia there, right? After the kind of, dealing with the tragedy of so many men that died, right? And of course, the irony is by 68, it backfired because all of the philosophers that were on TV are now ardent communists, including Sartre and so on, right? So there's a lot of strangeness. And then, of course, after 68, the new philosopher movement results in a total reactionary position. And even Lacan, by the time of the 70s, has basically adopted a kind of civic liberalism, right? So his own politics and Freud's own politics, I would say, tend to be somewhat liberal, in part because they are scientists. Lacan was a psychiatrist. He was an analyst. He sees hundreds of people. He's responding to the norms of the day, the norms of the present. And I think that there's something about that which, one of the interesting things about the structure of the unconscious, if you take on the Marxian view that Lacan did, is that basically the unconscious is a reactionary bourgeois formation in a certain sense. Right. So the unconscious itself is politics, Lacan said, right? So, there's a number of suggestions that Lacan lays down that can be taken up in a number of ways. But if we take the Freudian, I'll stop here. If we take the Freudian truths as truths with a capital T, I think that what that means is basically that they have relevance across the political spectrum, pure and simple. So I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it kind of helps. One of the interesting fascinations I have, and specific to Lacan, and you may or may not know my position on Lacan. I don't. I tend to be a Lacan skeptic.
That's cool. That's good. I'm glad we're talking. I'm not trying to convert you or anything. I'm just I'm here to hang out. It's a Friday night. We're just chilling.
Exactly. What I would say though is that I've been fascinated by the influence of semi-Stalinized Hegelianism on French thought in general through Kojève, and thus explaining some of the more
It's so interesting you call Kojève Stalinist, because Leo Strauss found in Kojève his educator. like that's another thing about the ambiguity at play here, right? Like I think if Derrida, Heidegger, Lacan, and all these other kind of leading lights of European philosophy find in Kojève their teacher, and he himself was no philosophy professor, right? He was like a servant. Who just happened to be like a great reader of the phenomenology, and gave these really interesting lectures. Gave these interesting lectures also like right concurrent to the rise of the Nazis. Like Lacan would, I think, leave one of Kojève's lectures and attended the Berlin Olympics when the Nazis hosted it, right? And this is like right at the time when he's inventing his notion of the mirror stage. It's a very interesting historical thing. But I feel like intellectual life was very weird in that sense. Like Marcuse is a part of the OSS, right? Like the early, I don't know, like, is Kojève a Stalinist? I mean,
no, but yes. I mean, it's the sympathies he had privately are somewhat known. That he was highly sympathetic to the Soviet Union and the Stalinist period, which in the rise of fascism is totally understandable.
Yeah.
How deeply he would have been. I mean, like, who knows if he, I don't see a lot of evidence that he, like, for example, knew like historical and dialectical materialism as a text or anything like that. But there are also overlaps between his reading of Hegel and the USSR's formal reading of Hegel before 1945. Yeah. And it is ambiguous. I mean, Kojève's relationship to Leo Strauss is, I think, amongst leftists, far little studied. I agree. Because Strauss freaks them out in a way.
Kojève was somebody who set a lot of people free. Like I feel like he's the same figure like Badou. Like object-oriented ontology, which is kind of used to be a thing. If you study like continental philosophy, whatever, in the early aughts. Badou was a Kojève for all those young philosophers, I would argue. Ray Brassier, and so on, like Quentin Meillassoux, right? And I think that there are in philosophy, there are sometimes figures who come around and are kind of master figures, but not masters in like follow my dictates, but masters in like they've come up with some way to sort of help you generate new concepts or help you generate new thinking. And that was, according to many of these like French philosophers, that was Lacan's role in a way. Like Lacan was kind of this provocateur. He didn't want to write. He was very Socratic. Like he just gave seminars and there was like 1,000 people that would come, anarchists and communists and really bourgeois psychiatrists, like the whole, and then of course, because like I mentioned before, the French culture had kind of this enigmatic thing of the intellectual, which is very weird for us, right? Like, I mean, I love Russell Jacoby's work about the history of American intellectuals, but shit, like you get a little nostalgic when you think about what the power of the intellectual was in a certain sense.
Right.
I
mean, you had the Sorbonne rock stars, basically, which we, even during the height of the public intellectual, we had nothing like that. I mean, arguably, maybe Zizek was kind of like that in a kind of faded, farcical form, and I don't mean that.
Somebody was saying, I don't know. I've been listening to your the Varn vlog a lot, and I don't know if it was here or somewhere else. Somebody said, yeah, we went to see the Zizek talk at Occupy, but it was so small. Yeah, but it was. I mean, right? I mean, like, God, we shouldn't overestimate, you know, what the platform that we have. It's extremely, extremely limited. Not like me, but like the highest amongst the people that study what I study, right? In terms of their notoriety, it's still extremely modest. And that's very unfortunate, right? It's unfortunate that Alain Badou's thought is not catalyzed by a kind of rock star status. I mean, I think unfortunately you do need a bit of that. I don't know if you agree with that.
I'm torn on it. I mean, Badou's an interesting figure for me because I would have finished grad school in arts, MFA in poetry. But highly theoretical background. My philosophical background prior is actually analytic.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But Badou was
and Marx. I mean, you're a huge reader of Marxism.
I am, but
you don't think Marxism is a philosophy at all, like you don't. I know you don't.
But I would say that Badou was really influential in my thinking. Not so much that I agree with a lot of his positions, and I find some of the scholarship on him unnecessarily opaque.
I accept that. Yeah. So possibly my own. Well, I have very little, but yeah.
Well, I mean, I would say I don't feel that way about reading his works, even though you do have to get into a certain frame of reference that is often hard for Americans in specific, even Americans who are more used to, say, the French philosophy that would have been popular when you and I were young, which, would have been like the deconstruction, post-structuralism period of the like 90s.
Have you read Derrida recently? Like, it's really fun to read him. Like, I was reading the Postcard book on Socrates. It's like, this is like really nice. Like, this is like reading fiction, right? Like, this is really good literature, right? This is like,
that was how I learned to appreciate Derrida, because when I read him as a philosopher, I was like, I could sum this book up in like basically 5 paragraphs, because what he's doing is more like a literary work where he's modeling what the point he's making instead of just making the point. But it's been interesting to see how fast the even in left intellectual that particularly Derrida, like Derrida was the prime thing you saw on cultural studies, English, all kinds of PhD reading lists. And by like 2012, it felt very old hat in a way that
Yeah.
I'm not entirely used to with a
Yeah.
philosopher who recently died, but was that important?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the reasons for that are curious and interesting. I've thought a little bit about it. I don't think anyone's really given an answer as why. I mean, there's a few speculative points we could raise. I think there's an intergenerational piece.
Mhm.
There's a strong sense in which after 2008, I think that the political imposition of austerity within humanities departments necessitated that comp lit and philosophy departments take political thinkers much more seriously than they ever
Right.
have. That's not to say there's no politics in Derrida. There is, but it's really hard to make it robust. Even Spectres of Marx is really lightweight, and it's a lot of fun, but it's extremely brittle, in my view. But he does exercise a certain muscle of thought, which I think is extremely valuable. Like, I studied with several of his students, Avital Ronell, who's unfortunately, or I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, but it's kind of been semi-canceled. But like, she has this beautiful extemporaneous Derridian reflective, speculative capacity, where she becomes a kind of street philosopher in a way, kind of very Socratic, where she can kind of subsume this, and it kind of is in a way coming from the debt of Heidegger. There's something about left Heideggerianism, which privileges mood over rationality. And so you get in these seminars and you have this kind of seductive experience with the kind of pure thinking. And one of the scholars that studied under Derrida said that every time that she went to a seminar, she felt like she was on a precipice, and that he would hold her over the edge, and then by the end, he just let her go. Just sort of entering into this kind of infinite mode of thinking and meditation on the concept, and maybe it's kind of philosophy as therapy, right? Which is as long as you're honest that that's what you're doing. I mean, it may be problematic, but if you're honest that it's not more than that, okay, it's better than doing like I don't know, Jungian stuff.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, young. I have been interested though. I think Badou's influence is, for those of us who work in the humanities at a graduate level or above, felt it if we came in about 10 to 15 years ago. But unlike Zizek, even though in some ways Badou's politics are clearer, I mean, I know that seems strange because the way he writes is, I mean, he's, it's a kind of anarcho-Maoism that like someone like Francois Laurel will take him to task for. But he never had the same kind of breakthrough moment in the United States outside of academic departments. He wasn't, I hate to say it, but he wasn't memeable. in the kind of way that a Zizek,
that's true,
or even some of the early object-oriented ontologists.
Well, there's two reasons for that. One is English isn't good enough, and two, I mean, it's okay, but two, I think more significantly, he is very classically a master philosopher, if you want to use that term. And I don't really think that a public celebrity in the United, like on the left, the conditions are not ripe for that kind of celebrity to break through, right? So he would always be somewhat of a shadow of Zizek in a way. It's not true in France. I mean, he wrote a book on Sarkozy, which was The Meaning of Sarkozy, which was extremely popular. And he was, one of the good things about Badou is he has no problem arguing with fascists. Like, he gets on public television and fights things out, and insists on maintaining communist lines of fidelity and things like this. I mean, I just did a podcast on my podcast with some Badouian scholars, that are like really good with French. They way into the archives, and they discovered that Badou's communist Maoist group broke from the main Maoist organization, the Gauche Prolétarienne, and actually achieved one of the largest in the 1970, early 70s up to 77 immigrant uprisings of mostly Algerian immigrants, which they can kind of take full credit for and things like this. So, but he was like, up at 5 a.m. every morning, training and getting beaten by police and doing factory interventions. He saw 68 as this moment, not as most French intellectuals did, of the activation of the student consciousness, but rather of factory workers. And so dedicated all of his attention to factory worker mobilization and factory worker organization, et cetera, et cetera. So there are some very serious politics that he has, although he did abandon those politics in the early 2000s. But yeah, I mean, the third part of Being an Event trilogy is coming out in 2 months, and it'll be interesting to see its reception. I think most people agree that if you really want to sit down and take the time to work and kind of fully understand Badou, you have to start with Being an Event. And a lot of folks that take the book seriously, they get a lot of returns out of it. Like it can be a life-changing experience of reading it. I don't know if it's life-changing for me, but it is definitely reorienting, So.
I went through it about 12 years ago and thought it was very useful, but I would say it's interesting. One of the things when we talk about Maoism now, and it's the particular French Maoism of Badou, is that demarcator in our contemporary politics has now shifted meaning. From that kind of French Maoism to MLM, the kind of post-80s North American third worldist thought, to now kind of official Chinese state Dongism. And Badou has very little to do with the Chinese state after the Cultural Revolution. I mean, he does seem to have, I know I've read he's been involved in memorializing the Cultural Revolution in China even today, but that his form of Maoism 10 years ago was very rare, but you would encounter it on the far left. And now you kind of don't as much, actually.
I think that's true. I think that there are general, Francois Laruelle wrote a book called Badou and the Anti-Badou, The Introduction of Maoism into Philosophy, where he tries to make an argument similar in a way to Domenico Losurdo on Nietzsche, which is basically that you can't really understand the conceptual architecture of Badou without thinking about the importation of the political condition of Maoism, which I think is a very wrong reading. And actually Badou in a way theoretically makes a split from Maoism, which we could talk about at a certain point in his career. But there are residues of Maoism, no doubt. So that's one point. He was very interested in the Arab Spring. He wrote a book called Rebirth of History. He kind of tried to make an argument that historically, right now, we're kind of most akin to pre-1848, kind of a general incoherence on the left, lack of party form. Marx talked a lot about the party of anarchy and the party of order as these kind of two very acephalic and nascent tendencies, and Badou's very much on that line. I liked that book that he wrote there, right? Although some people say when the Yellow Vests came about, Badou was very wishy-washy about whether to support them. And what I've been learning about the Yellow Vests very much impresses me. I don't know about you, but it's very promising in a way. It seems much better than American Occupy in terms of its class politics. Its activation of workers is extremely rigorous. So
I would agree that there's a much better class politics in Yellow Vests. I would also agree, though, because of its class politics, it's a lot harder to clearly place on the spectrum of the U.S. activist left.
What do you mean by that?
It's all over the place on social issues, and I mean, it was a broad movement, and broad movements tend to have contradictory characters.
Yeah.
You know, that's true for any class-based movement. And so the U.S. left in particular, for reasons that I think are largely have to do with our post-68 inheritance, and you know, a lot of my work is actually tracing the post-68 inheritance isn't really just the 68 inheritance. It goes back 30, 40, 50, 60 years. But the focus on students and a kind of cultural, ideological semi-coherence is a big focus of, say, what people's issues are with Occupy, are, you know, how it unfolded. Whereas the Yellow Vest, being a broad-based, mostly class movement, has elements that we would see as hyper progressive, for lack of a better term. I don't like that word, but and then elements that we would see as, you know, people would accuse of being red brown, and you saw these debates in the United States around it, partly because like the idea of a broad-based class politics is so foreign to us now that that those contradictions are not something we're readily able to deal with, even in the context of something like the DSA, which you know, which is not working class, but it's a very specific.
So I'm glad you raised that, because I wanted to ask you your thoughts on, because, you know, like one of the things we're talking about, psychoanalysis and philosophy, like, you know, consciousness becomes interrogated by Lacan and a lot of kind of anti-phenomenological orientations, even the notion of the worldview, and even Lukácsian standpoint theory. Like a lot of the value form people say, well, you know, fuck these kind of early Marxist humanists, or they say, you know, what is consciousness good for, and things of this nature, or Lukács is the origin of everything that went wrong, precisely because who can tell what a fucking standpoint is, right? It can be used and taken over by corporate America to, you know, who knows, right? So what's so unique about the working class's worldview? I know I'm talking a lot here, or we're saying a lot, but my question, I guess, is sort of like, don't you think that we're at a conjuncture where some minimal work in the very basic education of class consciousness is necessary in America?
Oh yeah. I mean, I often pick up Al, I forget his last name. He's a translator of Michael Heinrich, but we both talked about how.
Oh yeah. I know you're talking about,
we both talked about how Al Lacasio. We both talked about how to each other about how, like, man, I kill for just trade union consciousness in the United States. Like, and what's interesting is right now we are at a time where we've actually seen it bubble back up again in the U.S. for the first time probably since the mid 70s in a real way, and in a way that it kind of even didn't during the Great Recession leading into Occupy. Because that was such a moment of defeat. It was so clear how, like, it was really hard to defend if you knew, for example, the concessions the United Auto Workers have made leading up to their kind of liquidation and the bankruptcies. It was very hard to defend them, and most of the left's defense of, say, the United Auto Workers during the Great Recession fell on deaf ears amongst workers who knew how the United Auto Workers had worked versus left idealizations of it are, you know, and so at that moment it really did seem like, despite the fact we were in a financial crisis, that this was not a moment of worker solidarity. That's not true right now, like, at all. But the left did kind of get caught flat-footed by it. Like,
this is why I think, like, you know, political philosophy matters, right now.
Mhm.
Like, this is why I think actually, like, taking on liberalism, in exposing liberalism, where people who attest to it unbeknownst to themselves need to be called out on it. Like, this is why I think, like, ideological struggle and class consciousness are, even though they're bad words for, like, the very intricate history of Marxism that you're intimately familiar with, and they have these certain taboos and connotations and dangers. At the same time, it feels historically as if we're in a very virginal place for the class struggle. So as such, we need to play with things like opportunism differently, right? Like, I don't know, in this society, like, this kind of hyper entrepreneurialism, like Tikkun, the radical leftist, mostly French theory circle. I'm sure you have heard about them. See, there's no use in saying the word worker anymore. You should say needy opportunist, because this is what we've been reduced to, right? And they're right. They are right about that. And even if you see the squad, like I saw Rashida Tlaib try to kind of present this sort of really, really weird, kind of hokey, kind of clumsy affirmation of workers, which didn't feel right in the context of American entrepreneurial, in the context of a society in which freedom is so definitively located at the entrepreneurial nexus, right? It doesn't feel comfortable to box people into this. I don't know. I mean, but maybe that's why it feels more comfortable to categorize people vis-a-vis different identities. I don't know, but, like, you see my point. Like, there's a question here that I'm trying to raise with you. I don't know the answer, but
I think it's very interesting right now because the working class as presented in the American discourse is largely ceded to the right, unless it's black and brown, and then even then sometimes ceded to the right, if we're honest. And the actual demographics of that are somewhat disheartening, because there has been an assumption by Democrats for 2 decades that basically the extension of the particular alliance of educated African American women to the Democratic Party would extend to all people of color. And from 2006 broadly till about 2016, that was largely speaking true. And in the main is still true, but it gets weaker and weaker and weaker every election cycle.
Right.
And also its historical trajectory is actually quite recent. Like, it doesn't actually exist before 2006, except in the case of specifically of black women. We can't really speak to the majority of the black male vote, for example, because 50% of it was disenfranchised, being its location in the South, the felon laws, et cetera, even after the end of Jim Crow, has meant that we don't really know like the actual opinion of a lot of, say, working class and people shut out of the working class black men. In polls, they're just not relevant. So,
yeah, I mean, I feel like Adolph Reed can bust his head against the wall trying to forge a certain, I don't know, sectarianism within the PMC, right? But I don't know how successful he's going to be, because I do think that a lot of our conflicts are decided in a moment where it matters, and in reality, we face a political situation structured on electoralism, where what matters is always judged in the measure where we're farthest from it, right? Which is why the only direction forward for me is something like a different experimentation in the party form. And all of the hesitancy, although, Donald and the Marxist Unity Group within DSA is promising, I think they got something like 30% of the vote. That's very promising to me. 30% is impressive.
Yeah, particularly when you know how small that slate was. Because it was like 8 people and like maybe 50 or 60 fellow travelers, and they were able to do that in a group of 100,000. But I do think it's impressive, but I also I keep pointing out that the left has a myopia of failure because of decades and decades of small numbers. And so we take 100,000 paper members of an ostensibly left organization, probably, and one that in the public discourse before Biden, and that's actually kind of important, probably hit harder than its numbers would realize. I still have to point out that in the spectrum of, say, 360 million, you can drown that in a bathtub. Like, that's not a mass political movement. Even a little bit.
I'm thinking here of the opening of Mike Davis's Prisoners of the American Dream.
Right.
How basically any chance of electoralism died, like not in the 80s, not with neoliberalism, but like before that, like in like the 60s, early 70s. And you know, one of the things that interests me apropos this question of debating liberalism within philosophy, within thought, and so on, is I don't know if you've read The Liberal Tradition in America by Louis Hartz. He's a neoconservative historian. And I remember explicitly in Prisoners of the American Dream, Mike Davis takes the Hartzian school to task by saying that, well, America has a liberal telos. Because the argument that Hartz gives in short form is liberalism has remained the only political ideology, despite any attempts on the right or on the left of contesting it, precisely because at its origin of the American Revolution, there was not a contest of a feudal overcoming. It was a pure bourgeois revolution. And in that way, we've been terminal liberals, and we remain terminal liberals.
Except in the South.
He argues that the planter class was and this you might, and Du Bois kind of says this in Black Reconstruction as well, in a way, which is the planter. Do you mean that the planter class lived on after Reconstruction? Because my understanding is that it was actually abolished as a class.
No, it was destroyed. But it does mean that there in the South there was a contestation between a quasi aristocratic form, a hangover transition form, really.
I see what you mean. Yeah.
Where there wasn't in most of the rest of the United States. You know, it was.
I see what you mean.
It was I agree with you that the United States, as a project, particularly manifested by the time of the Civil War, and I don't think you can really talk about a unified U.S. until then. Is a bourgeois project, and in its instantiation here, because of a lack of aristocracy and because of its settler nature, ironically, but different from, say, the Spanish settler colonial, which is something I think more people should contrast the U.S. with, is like, go look at the differences between U.S. settler colonialism in specific and Spanish settler colonialism in New Spain, because in New Spain you do have a new but modeled on an older aristocratic class form that is explicit, whereas in the US the aristocratic class form is implicit, except kind of in the planter class. And so, you know, I think a lot about this because I do think that's also why that in Land Grabs, which is something Ingalls realized, like you can read letters where he talks about this, was why he thought that the United States was going to be one of the very last places to develop any kind of class consciousness. And he thought, and this is ironic if you look at what a lot of the left obsessions today, that monetary schemas were always used as a funnel valve to stop class consciousness from developing. Which he says in a letter to Marx, I believe, right after the Civil War. And that
you mean prior to like Fordism?
Yeah, I do. But we still have these habits, there is at least competitor school of thought right now that basically sees the problems of the American left as a policy problem, mostly around monetary and fiscal policy.
Yeah.
And there's a long tradition of that in the United States.
I got you.
Going back way before Keynes and MMT,
Mhm.
going back to like Henry George.
Oh yeah.
And so,
and Lash writes all about this. Like Lash
yes, he does.
Great. He's great on that history. He's fabulous on that history. Like
people need to read the first. No one reads the better Lash books, unfortunately, except for maybe Agony of the American Left.
Agony is a great book, but also I'm looking now at his dissertation on American liberals in the Bolshevik Revolution.
Which I read recently. I didn't think it was that important at first when I was sitting down to write a book on Lash. It was the book that we originally were like, oh, we can skip it. It like doesn't seem to matter. I haven't read that book very recently. I read his first 4 books as almost one book, which is about the weird trajectory that led us to 1968. From the Civil War up through up to about up to the 1970s for Lash. Because I mean, like some of the stuff he says about Harrington, for example, it hits home still.
Yeah. No, it's good. So what is Lash's relationship to Trotskyism? Because I can't figure out whether Lash is a nostalgic FDR New Dealer or whether he flirts with that, but there's another tension of a kind of nascent Trotskyism, which never blossomed, because I doubt that Lash would ever become a Trotskyist militant. He would never. I couldn't picture that, right? Although in theory he might have some sympathies to it, and I think that one of his relatives, if not his father, was a Trotskyist. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is correct. And what I would say is you read Lash up through the Minimal Self, and what you see is a person who is very much a workerist Marxist. He sides with the SPA, but in the World of Nations, there's a chapter on FDRism where he basically says it is a progressive attempt to recuperate the ideas of the late 19th century populists and the socialists to revive the original semi-aristocratic bourgeoisie as a class.
So he's opposed. So he's been opposed to it.
Yeah, he's opposed to it, even though later on he doesn't sound that way. Like in the 80s, he does not sound that way at all.
Because shit got so fucked up. Like because because in Culture of Narcissism, like he is like legitimately nostalgic for this very short period of its emergence. And the various public service programs that came from it, and like this is the best that we have, and he's almost like a kind of Make America Great Again liberal in a weird way.
And by the 1980s, he's like almost rejecting himself. Like,
but that's the Lash that like the Red Scare podcast girls and all these other people latch onto. And I see the seductiveness of the critique of elites and of the hypocrisy of liberalism.
Right.
It's all good. It's all there. I think the psychoanalytic theory is also good. A lot of Lacanians, like Zizek, wrote a long review of Culture of Narcissism fairly critically. But I actually find Lash very comparable, and I try to outline this in my forthcoming book, with Lacan, right? In different, more complex theoretical things we don't really need to get into. But I think that he made some extremely prescient points. However, a lot of psychoanalysts don't like him because he really sociologizes and historicizes psychoanalytic concepts, which I don't have a problem with that, but a lot of people do, right? So
yeah, this is actually one of my rejections of psychoanalysis is a refusal to sociologize and historicize itself. So like,
well, no, I mean you can still do it. There's nothing, but there's nothing holding you back. I mean, you know, it's I mean,
I guess that could get us to an interesting debate because Lash is one of the few people that in America I've often said he's damned by writing clearly. That like he writes so clearly that people don't realize when he's using psychoanalytic or even Foucauldian concepts, because he does.
Yeah. No, Lash was well read. I mean, he read widely. He read uncharitably. Uncharitably. I mean, his critique of Marcuse, his critique of Deleuze and Guattari was uncharitable and really almost caricatures, So, I'm a little like, if you read his critique of like new left philosophers, it was coming from a place of a profound frustration with their political impotence, which I get, but he didn't like. It's very ironic to me that he wrote the foreword to Life Against Death by Norman O'Brown because he hated Norman O'Brown.
Right.
Just so happened that the two of them were the most famous psychoanalytic theorists in America, so he had to write the foreword, right? But like they didn't like each other. This guy's like Norman O'Brown is like this mystical Freudian who like turned to Shia Islam and these kinds of things, and which is cool in a way. And he's smart and he's good. And Lacan actually loved Norman O'Brown. So look, I mean, I think Lash is a figure of some integrity, and he should be taken very seriously. By the way, what happened to your book? Did you publish it on Lash?
No, my book is still being finished. I'm writing it with Shallon Buntine, and she's busy with her dissertation. And then Zero got bought out before the contract was negotiated, so it's being written now much slower because it's not under contract. It will come out because we've done some original research on it. We've talked to a lot of Lash's students. One of the more interesting theses that I've tried to parse is amongst Lash's students and then his estate, there is a difference in how conservative he became, partly because his daughter is a conservative and he did work with her on the final book. However, it is clear that he did not want the final book published in the state it was published in.
You mean The True and Only Heaven?
No, I mean The Revolt of the Elites, which is the one everybody loves. I mean, I almost think of it as like Lash's Will to Power book, but like because there is so much of an influence of Elizabeth Quinn Lash on it. And
he's referenced at the beginning. I saw that.
Right. Yeah. And Elizabeth Quinn Lash is a conservative, which and Lash even after the 87 Tikkun essay exchange, which is the one that people cite when
with
they
like
want to say
Ehrenreich and these people,
and some Trotskyist and who reads is really clueless, honestly. He says he's done with the left, but then he writes this long like takedown piece of all the right's answers, because what in the Cocoon piece, he basically says for the working class, the left has just ignored the problems that actually exist, and the left has existed in the 1980s. Whereas the conservatives have answered those questions, but with lies.
Right.
And I think it's hard for us to understand like how dismal the U.S. left would have appeared in 1987. I mean, you were talking about like the socialist left. No, I mean, like until like someone like Mac Elbon's book Revolution in the Air, very few people even asked what happened. Where are there a million communists just disappeared without dying, and we don't know what they became? Like a lot of them became politicians apparently in the Democratic and even Republican parties, but like where did they go was not a question asked. And this is like, to me, this is one of the things that Lash is speaking to, and it's one of the reasons why the Red Scare people love him but read him out of the context of his earlier work. So for example, in his first 4 books, he goes after populism over and over and over and over again as having a piss poor understanding of cultural and material history, of having a simpleton's understanding of economics. And then
and even in The True and Only Heaven, he's not really a populist. He's more of a kind of strange communitarian virtue theorist, like
it's like a Lester McIntyre plus Wendell Berry.
It's very 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 idiosyncratic.
Right. But he still would have thought of himself. I mean, it's debatable if he still would have thought of himself as some sort of socialist, even in the late period. And I think what had happened is, in my reading, and my co-author disagrees with me on this. We've been actually going back and forth on this. But in the book World of Nations, he writes a somewhat infamous essay called Does Revolution Still Matter? And the ultimate answer to it is yes, but every conception we have of revolution does not fit the modern world. An insurrection against the nuclear state is basically a non-viable thing unless it's in terminal decline for internal contradictory reasons. Using it as a metaphor the way it was used in 68 for everything just rips it of its content. And so by the 80s, you feel like Lash has just said, well, no, there actually is no way to reconceive revolution now. And so the best we can do is this populism that I spent the first part of my career critiquing. So it's like a pessimist resignation, a position that he thinks, well, maybe it's the least shitty. But I do think that's a conservatizing move. But for example, like his student Kevin Masterson, Masterson, yeah, who is the guy who taught his classes when he got sick.
Yeah.
Has said that he thinks the paleo conservative adoption of Lash in like the aughts, which was a big thing. That's actually how I know about him. Was never totally honest.
Yeah, I mean there is a kind of theory. You have Trotskyist roots, and I'd like to ask you what I have my own theory. I'm sure you have your own theory here about, we know what it looks like when certain sects of communists become conservative. Somebody told me recently something beautiful, which is the Trotskyists, when they become conservative, they are the most successful and powerful conservatives.
with the exception of a few really, really diehard Maoists who became really, really diehard, like
who are you thinking?
David Horowitz.
Yeah.
But in general,
no, he's a fringe figure. I mean, he's powerful, but he's fringe.
Right.
Trotskyists attack the center, right? They go in the inside, they work in the institution, and they mold it in a certain way.
Right.
What's your theory about that? Just kind of moving away from Lash, like what? Maybe it's an easy answer, but like, what accounts for that betrayal, or that betrayal of fidelity? Is it that the world changes, or is it that they become opportunists? Is it that they have a kind of, I don't know, like a conversion, and are they sincere, or is it something that, like, I guess we could talk about James Burnham as a classic case. I know that Historical HM has just released a very interesting book I downloaded, which is like 1,000 pages, very exhaustive study on Burnham and all of his correspondence with CLR James and Trotsky himself, but also his betrayals and so on. So
he's a founder of the OSS. So like,
right. What's your theory of like, I know this is a slight diversion.
So it depends on which kind of conservatism you're looking at. And they'll say the Trotskyists turn neoconservative. So for example, Hitchens is an extension of permanent revolution and the belief that bourgeois revolution is actually liberatory to prior forms, and that if we haven't finished the bourgeois revolution, we can't have a communist one, and maybe we can't have a communist one anyway. Like, that's the Christopher Hitchens terms. But with Burnham, what you have, you have someone who looked at Trotsky's, say, theory of bureaucratic collectivism, and then had a break with dialectical and historical materialism as it was presented by Trotsky. And I'm going to say this because I'm actually one of the people who thinks Trotsky's a great political thinker, but there is a shallowness of economic thought in Trotsky. It's just not really there. Like,
Did it have to be?
it would have helped. So what you have in Burnham is a class theory based on this bureaucratic class that's then applied to everywhere. And Burnham's idea is basically, if you can't beat them, join them. And so, we can't get rid of this.
Burnham is the origin of Bannonism. Like
totally.
People don't understand the significance of James Burnham in American political reality.
He is at the root origin of both neoconservatism and paleoconservatism in America. And like for a figure to be on the crucial to both the two opposed forms of conservative thought, and to be really kind of not understood is crazy to me. I mean,
I know.
The fact that we talk about the PMC, let's be honest, that's Barbara Ehrenreich trying to do a Burnham but make it slightly more left wing. like that's what's going on there. But Burnham's theory is basically you pull out dialectical materialism and you remove economic thinking and just look at power relations.
Well, have you read Zev Stern, Israeli historian Zev Stern?
Yes.
He wrote a book called The Birth of Fascist Ideology.
Yes.
And the basic argument, just for the benefit of listeners, it's really interesting. It's basically like Marx or Nietzsche in the sense that Georges Sorel, the socialist syndicalist, is actually, according to Sternhell, the birth of fascism, in the sense that Sorel was a great dedicated socialist trying to further a general strike of worker agitation at the site of production for a couple decades, failure after failure after failure, sellout after sellout after sellout. And he said, you know what? We need to concoct a theory which will take on the bureaucratic elite and forge not a productive-based revolution, but an elite revolution. And then we have to invent a whole theory of nihilism and decadence for which the bourgeois elite are furthering. And we need to assault there. And that is what Mussolini did.
Yeah. Right? And Mussolini is a fascinating character in this. I mean, one thing I think people look to Germany and Hitlerism for the origins of fascism, which Hitlerism's weird. Yeah. Like it's actually like it's a different thing. It is related to like the German Romantic movement, but there is a real sense in which the right wing of the socialist and communist movement, which ironically begins in the ultra left wing of the socialist and communist movement. Yes, Mussolini's a maximalist, and Sorel is a maximalist syndicalist. Does really become the theoretical basis for fascism. And so while there is a way in which, yes, fascism is a manifestation of the crisis of capitalism, and one of the many, it has an unstable class coalition that is mostly petty bourgeois, but its intellectual foundations, in a way that Marxists generally do not want to deal with, and Sternhell spells it out unequivocally, is in trying to revise Marxism and lead a Bakuninist style revolution, but with Marxist style mass politics. Yeah. And that is that leads to all kinds of crazy things. But look at Mussolini's trajectory. Starts off as a Marxist and the Italian Socialist Youth. Enters World War I to promote revolutionary defeatism through an accelerationist argument that we should enter World War I and encourage Italy to fight World War I to destroy Italy. Flips during that period, starts thinking about the myth of the proletarian nation, which he admitted was a myth, and then becomes a social patriot. This is why, like, there's, in one sense, there's the sense in which red brownism is what liberals use to like distract us from all kinds of bullshit they're doing. But in another sense, brown doesn't exist without red. Like,
but in an inversion of what the liberals think.
Right, exactly. They're wrong about what's going on, but it is, if you give up on like working class politics and mass revolution, and you give up on a broad based politics, what inevitably, almost game theoretically, you're going to come to, no matter what your model of the mind is a counter elite theory. And
I want to say that the philosophical web that gives coherence to that is Nietzscheanism, right? There's a reason that Hitler sent "Thus Spoke Zarathustra" to Mussolini. So in the sense that that greatness that has been robbed of the proletariat can legitimately express itself in culture. So the transposition of the class struggle into the cultural sphere, you can see why mythology, like all of this kind of repressed greatness and things of this nature, becomes quite seductive and things like this, and why the right can speak to the working class within Nietzschean. That's why I've been so interested in studying the history of Nietzscheanism. I wonder what you think about that, by the way. I know that you've read a bit of Nietzsche. Like, what's your...
I was a Nietzsche scholar before I was a Marx scholar.
What's your read on Nietzsche today? Like, what's your take? Like,
Nietzsche is the smartest reactionary that has ever lived. I also think, even against someone like Lacerda, that Nietzsche is actually crucial to understand. Like, Nietzsche's right about certain things, about competitions between groups, that that's hard for people to deal with, such as like passive resistance and its deleterious nature. I also think...
Oh, you're talking about like resentment and like all this.
Right.
Yeah.
Slave morality.
I agree.
I think I think Nietzsche's actually correct about that. I think Nietzsche's actually correct in his critique of the early socialist movement being basically shitty Christianity. What is interesting to me is somehow Nietzsche studiously avoided his entire life ever dealing with Marx. I don't know if that was just ignorance, or what, because it doesn't come up. Like, now there are later Nietzscheans
Marx is underlined in Nietzsche's notes, because Nietzsche read on political economy pretty scrupulously. Nietzsche, I did a great podcast with Jeff Waite at Cornell, who's one of the best American left Nietzschean scholars, and he's this guy who he was the only Anglo allowed into the Nietzsche archive in East Germany during the Cold War to study unpublished original sources of Nietzsche's material. And so he's like a true Nietzschean scholar, etc., professor of German studies and all of this. And he has a member of the Communist Party, and he has pretty good, like, wobbly political commitments. He's worth looking at. But
he found that that Nietzsche did at least read one crucial Marx text.
That he was interested in political economy, and that Carey, a Philadelphia-based who wrote books on political economy, who's been lost to the dustbin of history. Nietzsche was obsessed with some of his works. Nietzsche wrote about the importance of thinking surplus as a category.
Which may be how Bataille gets his weird Nietzscheo-Marxism from.
You may be, but also like ideology, like religion, like there's so many points at which critique of species being like the whole, like, I know that you're way too much of a kind of value form Marxist these days to think about the thesis on Feuerbach as like very significant, maybe. But like that Marx at that point is where Nietzsche also resides, at the level of the kind of, there's a collective set of problems that they're working through together at that point. And that's really what Lacerda shows quite clearly. But Lacerda wants to portray 19th century socialism as somewhat of a homogenous phenomenon, which is a way of a kind of historical revisionism for our present, which I'm not really opposed to, right? Because I think that there's a difference between Marxists critiquing Proudhon and pointing to the errors of a theoretical nature versus conceiving of the class struggle in this more collective ensemble of activity, right? I like that because it shows how distinct the socialist movements were from liberalism at the time. And that, again, goes back to my original point, which is I think that today a strong critique of liberalism really needs to be put back on the table, which is another reason why I really like Lash, because he knew that too, you know?
Yeah, I have been really somewhat disheartened, even though people as closely associated with me hold this position, people thinking that Marxism is somehow just liberalism plus and not something like I think of Marxism as an emergent, like negative dialectical response to liberalism. So it does come out of it, but it does hold to many of the liberatory values of liberalism, but does so in a way that just points out over and over and over again, you can't do it, and you also don't mean it. Like,
I think this is bad late Frankfurt School Axel Honneth thought to make that conflation, right? I really insist that this is not, even though Marx would not place a big onus in the critique of liberalism as we speak of it today. For example, like why are we so reticent to invoke categories such as bourgeois ideology? Like when in fact maybe invoking such things might clarify positions and force people to make political decisions and kind of intensify points of contradiction and things of this nature in thought, in ideology, right? So that's what intellectual public sphere is about. So I worry that we think of Marxism as some kind of incomplete, because, you know, it's very interesting to study Marx's critique of the Jacobins themselves. You really saw them as a fool of history, right? Like you really saw them as a kind of ruse, as kind of like setting up a class system which they had no idea that they were doing, and criticized them accordingly. So I'm very much, I think we're thinking on the same lines generally. I know you've had a few people on your show that are interested in kind of pushing more of this thing. And of course, Jacobinism has a foothold in Trotskyism in a vague way. And I think that Trotskyism also itself has a tendency for collaboration with liberalism. And that's true. When you read Deutscher's The Prophet, that's what Trotsky did. I mean, in part because of his Jewish identity, but also because I think it was a historical necessity to make those friendships and those alliances and those connections. So there, you have to do that to an extent, but there are limits, and we really lose track of like what those limits are. Maybe, I don't know.
I think it's an interesting. My only pushback would be to say is, from what I can tell, there's no school of Marxism after say 1890 that does not make concessions to liberalism, and this goes all the way back into Lenin's.
Even Maoism.
Oh yes, I actually used to joke that combat liberalism meant combat liberalism, not to fight it, but to be a combat form. In fact. One thing I would say is the developments of liberal ideological notions of statehood and development of Maoist notions of statehood are almost identical.
Wow.
And that the Dungist reading of Mao is consistent with all periods of Mao.
Wow.
And I would say that in a way, one, because Mao is an explicitly class collaborationist. Two, it is explicitly developmentalist. Three, it is Whiggish. It just occasionally makes coalitions. It takes things of necessity, such as like national autonomy, and makes it an even bigger. I mean, the whole concept of comprador bourgeois, for example, which comes out of Maoism, is a belief that there's a good liberal force that is a liberal force for the nation to separate it off from the imperial core, because the imperial fight's actually more important than the capitalist one.
Yeah.
Like my critique of Marxism may be that we have never been able to fully combat the liberal tendencies in our own thinking, without capitulating to conservative ones, and this has been because if you want to look at, for example, Burnham, truly speaking, is an illiberal, truly. Like, he's probably of the American conservative tradition, the only one that I would say does not really come out, because if you read the modern Machiavellians and you read between the lines, what he's basically saying is fascism was right. It's just the fascists wanted to kill the wrong people. If we can take this whole ethnocide thing out of it, and have a managerial elite, which emerges from the military for Burnham. He makes that explicit in the modern Machiavellians, not from like educations and professions. Then we will, then the U.S. will dominate the future by basically being better at the Soviet and fascist game than they are.
Very interesting to think of Frederick Jameson's compelling little essay about a sci-fi imagining of a future American communist utopia, which is fully reliant on the activation of the military as the kind of groundwork of that, which itself is very Burnhamite. I mean, now in this conversation, I'm starting to wonder if James Burnham is like the most important American political thinker of the 20th century.
In many ways, I think he is. I mean, I also think like you find his lipstick traces all over 1,000 American institutions, including he created the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which Lash goes after, but that is explicitly the Tutt and former early ML, white ML and specifically white and Jewish ML and specifically, but Tutt and early ML pipeline into liberal legitimacy, and that invents both. I mean, if the anti-communist liberal left and neoconservatism comes directly from the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And what I find interesting, I mean, I didn't know we were talking so much about Lash today, but Lash is actually crucial for this because Lash documented it and was willing to say it in an academic book in print before the information was declassified and we knew it for certain, which now we do. So Lash wrote this in the 60s. This stuff wasn't declassified until like the 90s and aughts. And now there's books that basically can prove what Lash was saying, that the OSS was all up in the Partisan Review, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and that a lot of American left writers in their disenchantment with Stalinism, between the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the secret speech, those are the two big events. I think people underestimate how the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact really broke a lot of Western leftists, because the logic was never made sense. It's also late, and as a separate, unrelated, but that also begins the weird period of popular frontism, which really gets accelerated later, which is good for the European left, but is terrible for the U.S. left because that subsumes into the Democratic Party. Right. So, that whole thing, like Burnham creates that pathway, right? And given that he was an ex-Trotskyist, I can't think. I mean, this is one of the few times where I'm going to be conspiratorial. I can't think he didn't know what he was doing. Like, he knew how to capture people like himself.
Yeah. I mean that's interesting. I mean, this kind of goes back to circle back in a way to Badou, in the sense that, and this kind of circles back to your first question, which is, how do events or sort of moments of thought touch the entirety of a political spectrum? And I think this conversation has hit on that point, which is that, yeah, there are and Badou in his book Logics of Worlds reduces it to 4 like subject positions, 4 possible modes of response to the introduction of a truth within a given situation. And I really think that there's a lot of truth to that, because what it means is that the introduction of a truth into a world is universal in the sense that it touches all subjects, and it forces all subjects to make a decision, right? And so you can see why the trappings of Trotskyism become so expansive, and that we live with its strange residues even today in these very paradoxical ways. I mean, I still feel like a great book needs to be written about James Burnham. Like people need to understand the profound history. I mean, the fact that Burnham raised money to get CLR James, the author of The Black Jacobins, to go on a lecture tour pre-civil rights in the American South. And then he goes on to do everything that he does in the founding of the... It's just so crazy. It's like, what the hell is going on? Like,
yeah, I mean, you basically see a guy who is... In the Modern Machiavellians, he says, and I think more people should just... people occasionally read The Managerial Revolution, but they really need to read more Burnham. He talks about the importance of myths as basically a way to justify power and as something you have to do to justify the Pareto distribution. Again, rhyming with that whole surveillance of Stern Hall, like, you know, if there is a fascist core to American right liberalism, in a way, it's a concurrent development out of Burnham. It's not a direct influence from fascism, but
it's slightly too rationalist in its orientation. Like, it's slightly too philosophical. Like, it's too intellectual in a way where it's not as much of a perversion, like you said. Like, he's aware of the dangers of ethnocide and
right. He is, but he does say that, like, you could posit the building of a state off of racial notions, while also saying that, of course, these racial notions are bullshit.
Right.
Like, so like he was willing to, like, in the 50s, willing to say, well, we got to keep the South in the coalition to fight the communists, and if they want to believe in their stupid white nationhood, then we'll let them.
Well, that's that's the other thing that interests me from an other side. Like, to Trotsky's credit, I've actually think purely at the level of discourse, what, like, Fourth International and a lot of, like, early Trotskyists thought set the groundwork for was a certain thinking of the American civil rights movement, right? That was extremely influential to American liberals in terms of the rhetoric that they would use to frame it as a struggle. Comes out of a kind of influence of Trotskyism, I would say. Not entirely, but in big ways. So again, it kind of goes back to this very interesting, I don't know, like, profound influence, I guess. And I guess all of this goes back to the event of 1917 itself was something which was a true scission in the political makeup of the world, for which it's almost like a mimetic rivalry theory in a way, like, right? Like, I don't know. We haven't seen anything like it, maybe, since.
No, we haven't, and that also makes 1992 all the more tragic, and something that I think we underestimate the traumatic impact of. I mean, one of the things I've found fascinating, right? Like, when Zoomers go to reach for the left, and I teach high schoolers and I see this, they go to reach for, like, the most dumb forms of, like, idiotic internet. I'm not talking about Marxist Leninism, just idiotic internet Stalinism, right? Because, though, they're trying to differentiate themselves from the millennial left, and the millennial left, unless you're my age, and it's argued if I'm even a millennial, does not remember the Cold War, and thus the trauma of 1992, even for me, is only felt as, like, a residual, you know, oh, I remember that happening, and I remember that after that, like, a bunch of nation states changed, and then, but it's a huge deal in a way that I don't like. I don't think, like, for example, when we talk about, like, I've talked a lot about, like, you can make too much about generations, but you can also pretend that, like, there aren't material differences in generations which lead to actual differences in attitude, which I've occasionally accused Bhaskar Sankara of being, like, kind of doughy-eyed on. And one of the reasons for that is, like, okay, well, what's the material why are Gen Xers so fucking weirdly reactionary as a group, for example? And you're like, well, duh.
Right.
1992 happens. The third way Democrats happen. New Labor happens.
Right. Well, think about quantitative easing as one of the most vicious forms of generational weapons that has been used against our generation. Like, I'm sorry to tell you, like, that was an insanely reactionary thing, right? And continues to be so. And will fracture the very possibility of progressive socialist millennialism, in the sense that it ensures the wealth transfer amongst wealthy middle class and upper middle class millennials from their parents, which is going to happen in the next 5-10 years.
It's already beginning to happen.
Already beginning to happen, but that spells a new era of the material transformation of the class struggle in our time, in my view. And I actually think that actually might be good, because you'll have a hangover of a kind of ultra progressive, ultra liberal past with a new introduction of a huge property owning class that will have to face up to their own, and they're going to try to, cover it over and all of these standard things. But things are going to get a lot more interesting in terms of the class struggle in the near future. And maybe that's positive.
The other positive thing, Stefan Hamill has thrown this at me, is like, don't pretend that property values will always be valuable if profit rates really are declining. And I'm like, yeah, I guess you have a point, because another thing I think is going to be interesting about it, I've complained about, like, the fail son hangers on of the upper middle class and the left for a long time, which, as academics, I'm an ex-academic, but we know these people, like, we do. If they finally get their inheritance, they're going to have to clarify their politics one way or the other. They either have to lean into their material conditions, or they have to continue throwing their lot in with proletarianization, even ideologically. An individual can do that. As a class, they're not going to. But
correct.
But it's going to cut the wheat from the chaff. And I mean, like, there are class traders out there. I don't think that everybody who gets their inheritance is going to become a dickbag. But
I agree. It's going to create a lot of incoherence. It's going to create a lot of diversions. It's going to create the Bernie thing was a kind of prelude. I mean, in the same sense that the COVID lockdowns are a prelude of what our children will have to deal with climate change, right? It's a little introduction. So it's going to be a circus. It's going to be a lot of Bonapartism. That's the other thing I love about Trotskyism, as an aside, is they really encourage Marxists to read the 18th of Brumaire, which I really insist on as well. That's a random aside, but I mean, look, yeah, I really appreciate your reading of American history and of Marxist thought. I think that, like, your projects sound like excellent. So keep on doing what you're doing, and hopefully you get the Christopher Lash book published. I'm sure that there would be many interested.
I think there would be, but my thing is, I think the book is going to alienate not just conservative Lash scholars. I think it's also going to alienate the dominant interpretation of Lash amongst the people that we would now call the post or anti-left Marxist.
That's good. There's nothing wrong.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, but it will be a shot across the bow, and it's going to be misread. I mean, it's something I think a lot about, because, for example, people have associated me a lot of post and anti-leftists hate me because they thought I was one of them for reasons that I don't quite understand, except that if you looked at like Amy Teresa's weird list of names and then the names that I have mentioned in passing over the years, they overlap. Like I have mentioned Bordiga, I have mentioned the left communist critique of the left of capital. But I also said, for example, that doesn't mean anything after the fall of the Soviet Union because everything's the left. There is no not left of capital now. Like there's also like no endogenous workers movement that you can like conservatively tail. Like none of those things exist in the United and frankly, their existence in Europe is overstated. And their existence in Asia is overstated. Even they do seem to be a little bit more real in Latin America, but like it's just not. It's like a phony contestation of like workers' politics, where like, okay, one side is saying the workers are basically a substrata of professional workers who are more or less labor aristocrats, and the other side are saying the workers are blue collar petite bourgeoisie. Like it's proletarianization has already happened to an extent that no one ever predicted. Like
right, yeah, but yeah, that's very true. Yeah, a lot of media theorists and like Bernard Stiegler, one of my personal favorite like contemporary philosophers. He died last year, but he has this notion of proletarianization of the aesthetic, right? So that even aesthetics has been somehow proletarianized, and we're sort of dealing with a kind of new form of indeterminacy as a result of that. And I tend to agree with that, but then yet there is still a kind of structuralist reality of the persistence of things like bourgeois ideology, in the sense that you say the millennial property owners will still be structurally determined by that property relation, irrespective
an aggregate of course, yes.
Yeah, in a sense, irrespective of how beautiful the rhetoric sounds and all of that, right? And again, I think that the De Boer thesis of the spectacle society should always be put into our calculations here, in the sense of its deleterious and irrationalizing effects on our discourse, on which is why I've been so interested in political epistemology as a study, and sort of a return to a kind of sort of how do we think political rationalism in a post-French Revolutionary situation in a wide sense, something that interests me. But I mean, I agree with you and your other guests that we are at the dawn of some kind of new Marxism. That's very clear to me. And in that way, it's exciting. We should be excited in some way, right? Like, why not?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things I've told people the other over and over again that I don't think has been that there's been a lot of calls for left unity, and left unity without a program is basically just being nice to your friends. But the other thing that I've said is like, no, like you also need to quit viewing unity as like some kind of organic social harmony, because, for example, the right is extremely unified as a political force. It is, as far as infighting and everything else among itself, even more vicious in some ways, and I know because there's part of it, than the left is. The difference is that the right understands in some ways, because of its class positions, for mostly because its material interests are clearer in a lot of ways, actually, understands that internal division is actually probably useful as long as you shut it down when facing the enemy. So like you can be infighting all the time. In fact, it's good. It makes you stronger. And it makes you clearer. It clarifies your ideas. But when it comes to the actual program, even if you're on the losing faction within that group, you keep your overall material interest in mind, and you maintain some kind of power. I don't know why this seems impossible for leftists to understand, except that our class relations tend to be weird. I mean, I mean, like, we always talk about labor aristocrat. I mean, the PMC category, which is a category that's useful and like common conversation, as long as you don't actually believe it. Like as a useful analytic tool.
I think you're right. I think there's a lot more paternalistic ambivalence on the left than there is on the right. This is a kind of acceptance of a certain form of transcendental paternalism on the right. I mean, that's what defines the right in a way. So the contestation is minimized. There doesn't have to be a debate about what constitutes social antagonism in the same way that we have to have on the left. I mean, the socialist and the communist position offers such a robust critique to any the socialist critique renders the liberalist view incoherent to itself. That's really hard to overcome, especially if we ascribe liberalism to an unconscious class position as well, right? So, you know, the problems are set there, right? The stage is set for that, and then the notion of the enemy is also hugely problematized because the right has attracted the working class in the way that they have.
Yeah, I mean, well, if you were to look at the classes in America, the only class that is unified would be probably the upper strata of financial capital. Every other class is actually divided, including most of the bourgeoisie, frankly. Every other class is divided against itself.
Right.
In ways that are, we always talk about the identitarian ones that are obvious, like the racial and gender and whatever. We don't even talk about the regional, the sectional,
right.
The sectarian and other ways. And, you know,
right.
And yeah, I mean, part of this is, you know, people will say it's because I'll actually flash this on the screen. It's because left sectarians aren't interested in taking control. So pervert imports so no purpose to antagonize, but they're also in no position to take control. Like a lot of people who critique the left for not taking power are vastly overestimating the actual power of the left, and either in terms of its hold over the public consciousness, or in terms of its ability to do anything, or frankly, even in terms of its competency outside of very narrow specialized fields. And that's, you know,
right. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. Like,
it's a numbers game to a certain extent, but I also think that the question of the PMC and the operationalization of the PMC as a kind of political category that we can further simply doesn't have legs, right? There's some implicit limitations to the use of that category as a political weapon or coherent strategy to use against others. And I'm of the mind that the whole thing is too heterogeneous. I don't know what you think about. What's your take on like proper use of PMC as a kind of device?
I think it is a shitty analytic. It is a useful way to talk about a bunch of like even someone like Michael Lind, for example, will point out that PMC covers a bunch of different classes that don't actually share interest, even from his kind of right-wing class theory.
Exactly.
But it does describe actively a certain educated strata of liberals and, frankly, hangers-on amongst the working class that are in certain regions. This is why I like looking at regional distinctions matter, because regional economies are like, why is New York so into media? Like, there's a reason why it is. Like, it's historical, it's developmental. It informs like why we think of New York as like we meet all these people who are working class in New York City. They're real working class people. I mean, they might have shit jobs, they might have like a associate's degree, they might read some high theory online. But that's also tied into the cultural interest of that region.
Yeah.
And so like I like one thing I've never heard anyone talk about, because like the anti-leftists don't want to deal with this. Like, well, what would it mean for there to be the PMC-ification of actual working class people? And And why would that seem to be a thing? Because why can I predict someone's politics better by region and by response to region? So, for example, a counterintuitive that I noticed years ago, but I've only actually seen liberal sociologists really pointing out, that extremophiles in politics, so Stalinists tend to be from red states, out now, super MLs tend to be from red states. January 6ers, actually, for example, the majority of them from blue states.
From blue states.
Right. And so like the extreme the extremophile form of politics is it's like a response to feeling cut off from the main dominant position of that culture for reasons that, if you often look at it, are kind of material. Like, it's like, so there's everyone was like, oh, a lot of those January 6ers are small business owners. I'm like, no shit. I mean, like, you could have deduced that from just looking at standard Pew voting polls. Okay, why did the Democrats have the majority, although their majority is overstated even by liberal people, of people making under $80K a year, and then they jump and they have the majority of people making over $200K a year?
Right.
Like, what class makes about $100K a year? And you're like, in red state areas, oh, petit bourgeois. That's literally it. Like, no one else can do that. It's not professors, because if you look at the stats,
no. I think Catherine Liu and some of these Jacobin writers try to make a further point, which is what distinguishes PMC, although they get caught up because they don't use the framework, which I think that they would benefit from using, of symbolic capital from the French sociologist Bourdieu. Instead, they try to make a claim that's vague, which is sort of like, yes, PMC equals income, but it also is qualified by a certain cultural capital. So they kind of have the Bourdieuist analysis, but they're not fully like true to it. Like, I wish they would follow it through further in a certain sense. It's definitely not a Marxist analysis, but I don't think that they need, or I don't think that they care that it be a Marxist analysis. I think that it's a sound critique of liberalism today, and that's why I am attracted to it. But I just don't think that it has any significant legs politically. Like, it doesn't have any traction. Like, it's not going to produce effects in the world, really. It's great for op-eds. It's great for podcasts. It's great to reflect the guilt of millennial professionals and that whole process, which itself is very psychoanalytic. But that's about it. So
this was my issue with Catherine Liu. I said it once. It's like the shock of self-realization. It's like I can say this as a person with some Jewish background. It's like the Jew realize Zionists are shitty, and then you become obsessed with Zionists. It's like, because you're like, oh, I was almost part of that. I am part of that. Like, And but it also makes it gives its importance to the broader world, more importance than it actually has.
Exactly. Yeah. So anyways, I probably need to put the children to bed because my wife is out with friends, but this has been a incredibly fun thing. I know we're supposed to talk about the intricacies of Lacanian theory, but we talked about James Burnham instead, which now everybody has to go read the new book on Burnham by, let me just tell you the name of it if anybody wants to, is interested in it. I just picked it up. I just started it too as well. Anybody's interested. Yeah. Oh no, shit, sorry. Second thoughts on Burnham? It's not coming up for me. We can post it perhaps in the it's not coming up for me, but you've refreshed my interest in Burnham for sure. And this was a lot of fun to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Like to talk to you again. we'll talk in the future, and maybe we'll actually cover the Lacanian stuff. But I love this
maybe we can
conversation.
come back and talk about abolition of the family, because in my book I try to, because it's become a hot issue and things of that nature, and in a way that topic could be something interesting for us to discuss, perhaps. Kind of intersects with our mutual interests of Lash as well, and some of these points. Yeah, I mean, especially given that, there's a lot of interest in that topic these days, which a lot of it is disingenuous and inauthentic. But yeah.
All right. Have a great evening. We're gonna end here.